Yeah, just to build a little on what Vicky has said, and let me start with this question of empire. It's really important to remember, we usually think of fascism as arising in the nation state and being about nationalism, but as we'll see, these nations were also empires or had been and wanted to be again. And so part of what we want to do is always put the study of what is happening in Europe in this context of both imperial rivalries and what countries brought back from their experience as colonial powers to Europe and incorporated into fascism. Paxton, as Vicky said, is extremely important because Paxton doesn't start where so many start, which is kind of, you'll know if an extreme right movement is fascist if you take two from the ideology column and one from how do they organize violence to who knows what, how dictatorial are they. That's not going to get you very far. It's important to look at the concept, the context, and the concepts that fascism draws on, the crisis to which it may be responding. What kind of crises make fascism a possibility? And what are serious crises but maybe less conducive to it?
The class is called Fascism in Its Time, which obviously to everybody here is a timely subject. It's why we chose it, since we're all talking about fascism, whether there is a fascist threat, what is that threat, the nature of it today. It's on everybody's mind. And in order to understand that, we need to understand what that fascist movement and politics was like when it first originated in the interwar years of the 20th century. I should say that we are very fortunate to have two very distinguished scholars to guide us through this learning experience about fascism. Professor Vicky Grazia is an expert on Italian fascism. Professor Molly, I'm going to call her Molly, even though her real name, I guess, is Mary, but I've always called her Molly, on German Nazism. You've probably all read their biographies in the mailings you got. They've written many, many books. I want to mention just two, their first books. I have a personal reason for mentioning that, but I want to mention it for another reason. Vicky's first book was called
Culture of Consent.
Culture of Consent. Sorry, Culture of Consent. Mass organizing of leisure in fascist Italy. And what's interesting to me about that title is that we often think of fascism, rightly, as a profoundly repressive regime, but it also demands consent. And how that consent is mobilized and arranged is important for us even to understand today. And so I picked that book for that reason. It was her first book. And Molly's first book was called Social Democracy and Society. And it was a study of the radical working class of Dusseldorf in the period leading up to the late 19th century in Imperial Germany, leading up to World War and through World War I. And the reason I mentioned that is because fascism was a response to that kind of radical working class movement. And the other personal reason that I mention those books is because I was kind of the editor for both of them a million years ago when they first appeared. So I'm kind of proud of that. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Vicky and Molly. But I first want to say one thing. I asked them, is there anything they wanted me to tell you guys? So I'm going to read this. They wanted you guys to know that the two of them taught together the last time as teaching assistants at Columbia University in the early 1970s during a rugged political time, that's their words, and they say that they are filled with joy to get going again. So let's get going.
So thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, all of you, for being here, and for you particularly for helping to organize us today. So, Molly and I, this is an experiment. Clearly, we both retired, so we haven't been teaching for a few months, and this is a very important occasion. We value very much your time and your interest. You're not students in the conventional sense. What we've done is we've organized we have 4 sessions, and there are 2 of us, and there are 30 or 40 of you. So we thought we could maximize our time by dividing these 2 hours into very efficient units, in which we would speak each maybe for 20 minutes, then pause. You, meanwhile, collect and write down your questions. This is important, if you would, just to make them short. And we'd have Molly perhaps commenting first on what I said, briefly, or me on Molly, maybe disagreeing, opening up questions we think is important for you, and then hear some of your response. So today we will be addressing it's not the background, it's the context of late 19th century crisis, terribly overused words, we know. That will enable us to understand the terrain in which a new kind of social movement, which is named in Italy first fascism, term that starts to be used during the war period, but then becomes tied to a bigger and bigger movement in 1919, okay, and which then becomes sort of the paradigm. What we've done is we've brought to you, 3 readings. Okay, we know it's not always going to be simple to do the reading. We hope at very least that you take the Paxton piece again. If you haven't read it, if you have, maybe you'll want to reread it, maybe each time even, because all right, I work with him, Molly perhaps as well, at Columbia University, a very serene Southern gentleman, very engaged politically, a liberal, a true liberal, okay, who wrote about militarism in Vichy, who was called on by the democratic forces in France to testify in some of the trials against notorious fascist killers, torturers, in the 1980s. He tried, in the course of the 90s, as a result of probably three decades of teaching, I think I worked with him in the 70s, to clarify a very flexible sort of modeling that's deeply historical. Okay, so to give some characteristics about how fascism evolves. Okay? In its time, he's mainly dealing with the 19th and then the first half of the 20th century. That's a very important work because it's so lucid, it's so flexible, and it's so historical. The problem of writing fascism, it's often said, is key, rather than imposing certain kinds of theories, modeling minimum fascism, maximum fascism, laying out, it's got to be anti-Semitic, it's got to be anti-feminist, it's got to be anti-this, it's got to be pro-that, and so on and so forth. A rather more flexible and showing the possibilism, the opportunism of fascism, and in its time, and where it could come from, the crisis it responds to, and how it operates over time. So in this class, and I'm going to hand it over to Molly for a couple of words, before we what we tried to do is, in some ways, go beyond Bob Paxton, not because he's old or because it's been used up, but because since he wrote this in the late 1990s and published a beautiful little book, The Anatomy of Fascism, which I highly recommend to you. It's beautiful, clearly written. There's been a lot more work, and most of that work has wanted to emphasize the kind of the great crisis of the late 19th century, going up into World War One, and to then watch the rise of these fascists, but then to call attention to the re-entrance of Europe into a new round of frightful, ever more frightful imperial wars. Italy, I think, in the lead in 1936 with the attack against Ethiopia, under which, in the course of which, you have the terrible genocides of Eastern Europe and the ultimate collapse of Europe. So to understand that this fascism brings into a picture, it requires a very long sort of trajectory to understand how we can address it. Okay, that said, let me then turn over to Molly for a couple of words, and then I'll come back to
Yeah, just to build a little on what Vicky has said, and let me start with this question of empire. It's really important to remember, we usually think of fascism as arising in the nation state and being about nationalism, but as we'll see, these nations were also empires, or had been and wanted to be again. And so part of what we want to do is always put the study of what is happening in Europe in this context of both imperial rivalries and what countries brought back from their experience as colonial powers to Europe and incorporated into fascism. Paxton, as Vicky said, is extremely important because Paxton doesn't start where so many start, which is kind of, you'll know if an extreme right movement is fascist if you take two from the ideology column and one from how do they organize violence to who knows what, how dictatorial are they. That's not going to get you very far. It's important to look at the concept, the context, and the concepts that fascism draws on, the crisis to which it may be responding. What kind of crises make fascism a possibility? And what are serious crises but maybe less conducive to it? We think that by having you look in quite a bit of detail at what went on in fascist Italy and in Nazi Germany, this will help you understand about the questions you should ask and the issues to explore to analyze right radical movements today. In what ways are they similar? In what ways are they different? In what ways does the earlier experience help us understand them? In which way does it not provide any guidance because the situation in many ways are dramatically different, as we will frequently point out in the course of the next 4 classes. So with that, Vicky, I will let you take the first thing.
So how many of you, when you think about Trumpism, ask, gosh, what is wrong with representative government in the United States that this figure can become the leader of maybe 45% of the Americans, or present himself as representing 45, 48%, and conceivably then be elected to office. Is that something you think about? Is it easy to think about? What do you have to think about when you think that? Where do you have to go with your head? Anybody? Just it's not. Yeah.
I would say just that's how little the Democratic Party has to offer, that people are seeking elsewhere anything.
Okay, so you say the alternative just doesn't seem to, there's something wrong. Okay, that
Well,
would
we
be.
know what that is, and we don't know. So you go
Okay.
with the wild card.
Okay, so anything else? Yeah.
I think maybe my neighbors are dangerous.
Your neighbors are dangerous.
Maybe some of them have pretty crazy.
Okay, so you think maybe it's the people. I mean, I'm just trying to, it's people who who vote crazily. I mean, I'm just we'll try to make it a little normative here, so it's not, yeah.
The extent to which it is in fact a representative government.
Okay, so you ask, is this a representative government?
Yes.
I mean, yeah, okay. And so what therefore might you think about, just trying to pull anything else, and then, yes, sir.
I would say collectively a lack of morality.
A lack of morality in government, is that right? Okay, that's a good, that's it. Somehow this government, whether you mean the state apparatus or maybe the Congress, I mean, there's a lack of morality in the public, in public life. Let's just put it that way. I think that's, anything else, yeah.
The fact of the electoral college.
Okay, so, oh God, that's damn, electoral college, and then your apportionment,
I don't think about that question because I start from the assumption this system is completely bankrupt.
The system, okay, all right, okay, we'll get there. I mean, all right, the system, somehow, the system, the whole shebang, all right, yeah.
The inability to address immediate needs of the people of America, the gridlock, the constant
Okay,
bubbling.
excellent. So the parliament, let's use it, the Congress is not responding, it's not representing its constituents, or it's not representing the, rising level above to interpret what the constituents need in terms of, the nation, in terms of maybe the place of a country in the world. What more will take?
Yeah, I guess kind of piggybacking off the first comment, I think that, the liberal order is necessarily going to be alienating to a large majority of people. And, the one thing that it has been successful at least in America, is shutting off the left-wing alternative, so people go for a right-wing alternative.
Okay, so the whole political system is tilted against providing effective alternatives, or alternatives that might make for freedom, social justice. I'm sort of pushing it here. Okay, the reason we'll come back now. Not that out. Okay. Now, this is. So the reason I wanted to push you in that direction, get you off of the man, okay, or get you off of the, this opposition movement, putting the blame there, is to help you think about the liberal constitutional order. And so what I wanted to do is, go back, a minute to this. This is just a small. Hey, where are you? One more. Okay. All right. To think for a moment about the nature of constitutional government and sort of its center focus, parliamentary life, in the 19th century. And this is sort of like an exercise to get us going, because it's going to be the crisis of that system, with many of the reasons that you here are suggesting, in which this new movement, okay, a movement at least that calls itself new, is going to insinuate itself. It's going to begin to organize new party structures, a party militia, so it can work outside Parliament and inside Parliament. It's going to be developing all kinds of new appeals to build up a mass following, to maybe enter into parliamentary life, or maybe to destroy parliamentary life. So we want to go back for a moment at the real difficulties that a liberal constitutional order has in sustaining democracy. I mean, we have to understand it's hard, right? And if we go back, you said this is a great victory of the idea of progress, of enlightenment, of rationality, okay, in the time of the French industrial revolutions, the turn of the 18th of the 18th century, excuse me, in which parliamentary governments begin to emerge, and they are absolutely key for, in effect, saying that, hey, we now, in theory, represent the people. Okay? There's a constitution. Right? however limited it is, however expanded it is, which is based on human rights. It's a contract among humans, which defines the structure of power. It's true, it may be very limited in terms of how many people are represented, but nonetheless, the idea of rights and duties inscribed in law, in the Constitution, was regarded generally as an enormous step in human progress. Now, what we want to remark upon is, in reality, how unequal the forms of representation are. We know it very clearly in the United States, around the whole question of slavery, the fact that women don't vote until very late, the fact that the rural people are favored, but the ideal, of men, women, people working out the laws was terribly important as the basis of the legitimacy of political society, liberal political society in the 19th century. Now, what we see in reality is that this was very limited, and it was a constant struggle to keep it limited to the interests of property, basically. Gentlemen initially, all right, often not even organized in a party, but rather in kinds of salons or clubs. Okay? As by the second half of the 19th century, they begin to face the enlargement of the franchise. Now, you can say the enlargement of the franchise is coming through from all kinds of pressures from below, good pressures also amongst the gentlemen about bringing in their local boroughs into parliament, but not their people, and so on and so forth. But it's very much advanced, pushed forward in the latter half of the 19th century by the socialist movement. That is sort of the big point of pressure opening up in the 1870s on. These parties begin to develop. The parties have usually a double-faced. That is. They are both interested in revolution at some point, but also in working through parliament, through the vote, in reform. And this, of course, requires an enormous effort. This recognition is not simple. And in fact, Marx was very clear on the fact that spoke of parliamentary cretinism, how the entire kind of world of politics in the liberal countries becomes involved, all right, forgetting then the huge problems that are not addressed within parliament. And we can indeed say, hey, that's the system, it's a fiction. But, okay, if we do that, all right, the fact is we don't understand the politics, okay, which the liberals would be defending, which gradually more and more would want to defend because it becomes a bastion of power against the onslaught of forces who want to get rid of even that narrow form of representation, which is embodied and even in perfect form in the liberal system. Now, I say this becomes more and more a question, all right, of a crisis of development. Speaking of workers, okay, organized in mass socialist parties. We can think of Catholics. They're trying to get in or not, hanging back, and finally are brought in, and that creates a friction. Catholic in Europe, between Catholics and workers. We can see also nationalist movements who are pushing, especially under imperial, if they're in empires, let's say in the Habsburg Empire, you have parliament in Vienna, but then you begin to have all sorts of little parliaments in some of in the regions and local states who were demanding their own representation. And there are the constituencies who are objectively don't seem to be represented in these very narrow parliaments, which in the case of Italy, 7% of the people voted. I mean, it was so narrow. And in Great Britain, you'd find it might be 35% were eligible. You have very, very narrow numbers of people. Now, it's very important by the turn of the century, it seems to be large groups that are not represented. Women, of course, and there is a very fierce pressures on the part of feminists, Britain most notably. I think they're less ferocious in Italy, France, and Germany, where sort of somewhat familiar with these kinds of pressures to get in. But the big problem is the representation of what we're broadly called the middle classes. which didn't seem to have a party under the older system. So that you've got the old gentlemen, if you want, who are organized in a liberal, right? And I want to sort of show okay, Senate, this is the Italian Parliament, and you have the liberals in the center. And then you have the conservatives who might be great proprietors, maybe the right, and then the socialists, more and more the radical ones on the left. But the question was, who represented all of the discontents of these middle strata? For the left, the Marxists particularly, right, they should disappear. That is, to the extent that they would learn that they're becoming proletarianized and gradually come over to the left. This wasn't clear at all, and this remains a big question on the eve of the war. Who is going to lead these groups? For them to be led on by conservatives, they had to make a wider appeal. Okay? If for them to be led by the socialists, they'd have to be much more reformist. The liberals had a real difficulty because frequently the liberals were not organized as a mass party. They controlled very much parliamentary maneuvers. They knew how to organize, but indeed they did expand. So what I want to sort of quickly end with here is that by the end of the 19th century, right, the liberal parliamentarism is not doing its work very effectively. Right? It sticks to majoritarian principles. In fact, representative is very, very narrow. It fears that it's going to be overwhelmed by the socialist mob. Right? Maybe not the very handsome socialists who are in parliament, very well behaved, relatively learned, but the unwashed followers outside. Okay? And this sets conservative elites, particularly theorists, to thinking about other ways of representing people. And I just want to leave off here. So why Parliament? The idea of an individual representing his constituency. Why not corporations? Okay, the representation of interests, like in medieval times. The workers organized in a corporation facing the employers. Families being represented by their interests. And this was a very wide band of thinking. It cuts across, if you want, the world. It's very present in the United States, to think of different ways you could organize people to represent their interests. That was one. Bonapartism, okay, that's another. Like, why not have a strong executive? Why not have a consul-like prime minister who assumes huge powers, who's very charismatic? Crispi was one in Italy. In other words, to take extraordinary power, to use decree law. Okay? So this figure was emerging in the late 19th century. It's usually called the Caesarist or Bonapartist. Or the whole problem of the body politic. Maybe it shouldn't be represented in parliament. Maybe there are other ways of thinking about how you deal, for example, with the people. Okay, it was very, very important with imperialism. And the problem of their fertility, the problem of their coming together as a folk. So begin to organize, if you want, volunteer work outside to meld the people into new ways of acting and behaving, or to create all kinds of folk festivals where they identify with the nation. Yes, it's outside Parliament, but it reinforces very much the sense of another kind of body, the cult of the folk, so outside of Parliament. And finally, more power to the state apparatus, okay, which often goes on with Bonapartism. Okay, there's the king. He's the one that signs treaties, signs things into law. Empower more the military, right? Okay? To keep order. in emergencies, to call out soldiers, right? To put down strikes, for example, or demonstrations, or to reorganize Homeland Security, to broaden it. The Minister of the Interior in most countries had huge powers to spy, to organize local police, passports, migration, health laws, to count people, the census, make that bigger. So to grow the state bureaucracy and the powers within it. All this to say that this is an evolution going on in response, if you want, to the growth of mass publics, the fear of the crowds outside, the fear, if you want, of things changing, the enemy that comes with big cities. And we were going to want to keep that in mind when we come back to the actual rise of fascism after World War II. No, excuse me.
I would just like to emphasize a couple of things or add to what Vicky has said. Historians have often said the problem with Italy and Germany was that they didn't become bourgeois and liberal and at least quasi-democratic enough. They didn't modernize sufficiently, and that's why they became fascist. But as Vicky has suggested, this problem of how to both expand the people, the groups, the classes that are represented, but not really give them power. How the elites, conservative and liberal, could maintain control even as you had parliaments with expanding franchise was a problem that existed all across Europe to varying degrees. In Germany, the case I knew best, you had the anomalous situation where the Social Democratic Party was the largest party in parliament after 1912, and it effectively had no power because the chancellor was responsible to the Kaiser and not to parliament. So the chancellor could do something parliament didn't want, they could vote against it, and it didn't matter. Other countries, they had complicated three-class voting systems where the top 5% of taxpayers elected 1/3 of the representatives. In Prussia, the largest state, the next 10% of taxpayers elected another third, and everybody else, male, insofar as they had a little bit of property or sufficient wages, elected the other three. England and France were a little bit more open, but nobody was immune from this problem of how you deal with what was referred to in the 19th century as the social question. How do you incorporate the working masses and represent them? And how do you deal with the socialists who claim to represent them? How do you deal with the woman question or the Jewish question? And that was the terminology that was used. These were questions. And it's going to crop up again under fascism, particularly in Nazi Germany. So that's all I would add to what you had to say on the issue of representation.
Okay, so in some sense, we're seeing this as a kind of dialectic. Okay, the ideal of parliamentary representation is revolutionary in the early 19th century, and people, they're still being demanded. In Russia, it's not going to be until 1905. Chinese, the dissolution of the Qing Empire, they're trying. So this movement is actually global to get parliamentary representation at the same time as the limits of that representation are becoming very evident. Okay, doesn't mean the end of it by any means, but certainly by 1910, and we're going to see with other things happening, we're going to see how that problem of representation is really going to become kind of enter onto an emergency, a state of emergency. Okay, so open up to some questions. If you're disoriented, let us know. Yeah, go ahead.
You alluded to the fact that Germany and Italy both had crises that gave the rise to, or gave space to the rise of fascism. Right? Mm-hmm. If I'm correct. So, what do you think is America's crisis that is giving space to this sort of Trumpism / fascism?
Look, the question is very very well taken. And let me just sort of step back. As I was speaking, trying to generalize, because I think you look at the United States, circa 1910, you begin to get progressive movements. You have, if you want, some efforts to reform the political system, but you begin to also see impasses. So this is something quite general. England, so more or less everywhere there's a problem of how do we manage the transition to a wider parliament, to deal with the problem of representation of masses at the same time as the issues that parliament has to deal with, everything from colonial issues to voting for war credits to the problems of cholera and public health, become more and more technical and therefore more and more difficult to subject to the vote, okay, especially since you've got a lot of countervailing powers, okay, including the structure of the executive, whether often the chancellor, the prime minister, is responsible to kingships or to very slow-moving senates who represent sort of the most conservative elements of society. Now, your second question is just too difficult. Look, 15 or 10 of you said that there's all sorts of things going on. Government is a huge problem, it's a huge subject, and you could look this way, that way, and so on and so forth. And we see, too, here that the problem is not only with the parliamentary representation. We're not speaking about the question of the judiciary, okay, and how it operates. I probably, if you did a study of judiciaries, I'm not sure if they're becoming more liberal or more conservative in how they rule. I'm sure there are wonderful studies on it. I haven't seen. The military, oh dear, military is really tricky. Let's have more professional soldiering. Okay, that would be the ideal, the modern, liberal. But look at the Dreyfus affair in France, which actually overthrows the government. The idea that you would accuse a captain, upright Jewish man, of having spied for the Germans, and it practically brings down the republic. Masses of people in the streets denouncing, decrying the Jews who've infiltrated the state. Okay, and also crowds saying, no, he's a good man. So I think your question, you just kind of keep holding it. Right?
In part, what we want to do is give you today 3 general broad themes to think about. One about representation and mass politics, one which we're going to need to turn to very soon because of time, which is empire and imperial rivalries. And the third is war and militarization and the legacies of World War I. Then in the next couple of weeks, we will look at some of the particularities of Germany and Italy. And you'll begin to see all sorts of areas in which you want to say, okay, they had this kind of crisis then, and maybe we have something quite different now, or maybe something similar.
Okay, one more. Go ahead. Just so we could add, we'll take a couple questions. I'm not sure we're going to answer that.
You mentioned a tiered bracket voting system based on income. Was this something directly influenced by ancient Rome, or is this something?
No, these are normal. Who has a real interest in the society? Property.
Yes.
Let's face it, to the American constitutions, most all constitutions had heavy property requirements, or how much you taxed, or you had to be, later on, you had to be literate, you had to do your military service. There are all sorts of ways of saying, hey, an illiterate person, what interest? How could he be rational? Unless he's done it, maybe if he's done his military service, and maybe he's learned to at least sign his name with an X. So basically, it was only under duress that these systems become more representative, and at every moment, there's sort of deep anxiety about how to manage them. And one more.
And the argument was that men were the property owners legally through much of the 19th century, and that therefore they would represent women. That women could not represent themselves, but they would be represented through their husbands. And if they didn't have a husband, well, then it would still be their father or a brother who would.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable in terms of the, the understanding. Yeah, one more. Yeah, go ahead.
I know that you'll probably get to this in the imperialism section in many ways, but I'm also wondering if you might comment a little bit on some of the broad economic trends underlying that period.
Sure. Okay. So let's move on. I think we want to keep
Yeah, 'cause
the kind of time
yeah.
here. And okay. So let's just go to. It's not very clear, is it? But okay, let's. So what I wanted to, sort of let's move on and set this evolving liberal constitutional order with a tendency on the one hand to perhaps become more radical because it's opening up to the masses, we said, from the Socialist Party, but also to become more conservative because it was a pulling back on the part of forces of order. We want to look at how to situate this in terms of the evolution of European cross-Atlantic, I should say, the evolution of empire, which in the late 19th century takes on a very different form, okay, of occupied territories, which require significant investments, which require some sort of approval on the part of a parliament in order to get credits to pay for navy, to pay for army to protect them, which then bring about more and more competition. A very, very different mindset, which leads to new kind of notions of the globe as having racial hierarchy, and to a new kind of evaluation. This comes back to the question of economy of resources. Okay, how do you address the problem of the value of your population? How do you address the problem of the security of your territory? How do you understand the value of the resources that can be generated out of the lands that you are occupying, and the complementarity of those lands with the national economy? Okay. Now, Marxist historians traditionally underscored that this new imperialism was driven by the most advanced points of capitalism, okay, by big finance, which saw profits dropping during the course of the Great Depression of the 1870s and 1880s, but also the drop in the profits coming from big industry, example in terms of iron, okay, and therefore the need to find areas of export. Okay. And this, I think, argument holds. I mean, all sorts of studies about new flows, right? But I think we have to go further because most historians who have a global view say that it wasn't just the Western nations pushing out, but it's also the fact that non-Western areas, which were organized in their own forms of empire, are coming under very significant pressure, so that they are pushing back, that they are reorganizing their people, their population, their territory, and their notion of security to push back against this more and more globalized Western capitalism. Okay, so just to give a sense of this movement, in 1822, this is after the Napoleonic Wars, this is after also the sort of decay of the older empires, for example, in Spain, in the New World, Britain in the new in America. So you can see that big empire, the Russian Empire, huge, okay, which is Napoleonic War, is a verge of a big imperial power with extensions also westward. Right? But for the rest, the world, it sits relatively unoccupied. But look, if you go to 1885, when sort of the scramble for new colonies had started, and we can see Great Britain beginning with the red, beginning now to move more and more to occupy territories, right? To protect its investments, to think in very new ways about controlling territory it's occupying, to rethink the security of the empire. And here in 1914, in the wake of a kind of scramble for Africa, scramble for colonies, which takes place in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we can see a world which is pretty well filled up. Great Britain still in the lead. The United States now is moved into some of the Spanish areas and has a great deal of informal influence through the Monroe Doctrine, 19th century piece of work in Latin America, so keeps other Europeans from intervening. Now, this then unleashes very significant conflicts among the empires with lots of hot spots, right? So, hot spot would be what to do with the declining Ottoman Empire, where you get the Russians interested, the French are interested, the British are clearly interested, the Italians are interested. So, kind of conflictuality there. You get a great deal of conflictuality also over Japan with respect to Russia, over Korea, over China. Right? That decline there. So that's another kind of important spot. And you begin to, in that process, to get to see emerging new models of what a strong state should be. We're understanding now that a lot of the strength of the nation state, Great Britain, or the nation state France, or let's see, nation state United States, nation states, comes from the fact that they're empires. Okay? You go to, let's say, Habsburg or Austria in its smallness. It comes from the fact that they colonize locally, then the nation state has become stronger, and then it extends its power abroad, and so that becomes an important model. Right? A German Empire, unified, recognizes that it has a huge, vigorous population, and there's a lot of waste around. Over in the East, okay, in Africa, why should the French be there when the Germans are migrating? The French aren't migrating. The Italians ditto. All of a sudden, this search for empire, because what empire means, prestige for the monarchy and the military. You have, that's part of being a dynasty, that you have a strong state and an empire and an army and a diplomatic corps to which the kings and queens are bound up. They're also beginning to recognize that there's real importance in trying to control territory. All right? It's important, the model of the United States, that it has this big territory. Between 1822 and 1885, this emergence of the United States, it's beginning to be very worrisome. It's exporting new quantities of grain, and that is lowering the prices and causing crisis in Europe. Okay? Moreover, and so it becomes an interesting model, to have a secure, large frontiers, and that becomes a model that's going to be picked up on how to have living space. It's not a 1920s idea, a 1930s idea. It's already a late 19th century idea that it would be ideal to be able to protect your space, to protect your people and control them. Okay? and to be able to manage your resources so that they will be commensurate for a decent standard of living for your people. So the model then becomes tending toward a closed empire, even at the same time as Britain is leading a strong model that says open empire, open empire. So keep empires open, allow us to come in, get trade. That should be the model. So you begin to get a kind of clash of models by the turn of the century between what could be open trade, liberal trade, and protectionism, to prevent exactly the kinds of catastrophes and crises, economic crises that come when the price of grain drops, or the United States has a stock market crisis and it bounces it off into Europe. Okay, it's what we say in the United States is sneeze, and then Europeans economies would catch pneumonia. So very, very important to sort of insist now that this crisis. Another aspect of the crisis of empire is this thinking that goes on, new thinking about the body politic. Okay, we say the body politic. Well, yes, this is an old idea associated with absolute monarchy, the worry about the standard of living of your population. Not that it's going to be high, but for military purposes, okay, that it be present and that it be literate enough, available enough to be drafted. Worry about their fertility, worry about their migration. So much more accounting is going on about where your people are, what they're doing, are they emigrating, and are others emigrating into your territory? So we begin to get the first kind of clashes over immigration, very violent ones. We see between France and Italy, around the Italians. We see the beginning of these mass immigrations from Europe, and their worry about declining people, declining population, aging, more and more impotent people, whereas the yellow peril is growing, and the Americans are absorbing these people, taking them over and forcing them to become Americanized. Okay, so what I want to stop here then was saying that this now begins to create a huge sense of anguish, a sense that there is a decline in the European area, that there must be this rush somehow to redivide the world so that the new nation states can acquire their colonies, and the nation states, the great empires, can consolidate their own. And this leads to more and more militarization, but also more and more concern about the body politic. In this case, Foucault is very useful there. We're not going to get into him right now. A worrying about the governmentality of those bodies and how can it be done. Our article Gerland talks about race. Okay, look, this is the distribution of the human race. With all these the Caucasian descriptions, begin to get now racial mapping, wild stuff if you go on the internet, ethnic maps of Europe. This is a world human skin and hair map coming out of Germany in 1892, okay, which basically distinguishes between those with smooth hair, fuzzy wuzzies. It was kind of all dressed up with very scientific information, which now creates in empire real hierarchies of that who is races at the top and races at the bottom.
I just want to add two things to this, I think, very important discussion about imperial rivalries. One is that this age of imperial expansion, colonization, the scramble for Africa, informal forms of empire, are going on at the same time as what is referred to as the first modern age of economic globalization from roughly the 1880s until World War I. So trade, foreign direct investment in other countries is increasing. So at the same time as each nation is trying to consolidate its empire and protect itself, it's also, in similar ways as today, becoming ever more interdependent on one another, from which they both benefit from some things like the opportunity to invest abroad and reap the benefits of that, but they also fear goods flowing into your country and eroding your markets, particularly American goods coming into Europe. So that adds one more dimension to these rivalries. The second thing I want to say about empire is to bring up a question that historians of Germany have over the past 25 or more years been preoccupied with. Namely, what did the experience of being a colonial power teach Europeans that they brought back and then the Germans at least applied in their conquest of a territory in the Eastern Front and the genocidal politics against Jews and the Sinti and Roma. And it's very interesting, Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism. I'm sure some of you have read it, and you've probably read the first part on anti-Semitism and the last part, the third part, on totalitarianism, and often not the section on imperialism. But she's very interesting. She says, what is it that Europeans learned by virtue of becoming colonizers? And she said among the most important things is how to see whole categories of people as non-human, and then learn to treat them accordingly. And she sees that as one of the important things that's brought back. And there are complicated arguments about how this circulated and exactly what different countries learned. Is it personnel? Is it practices? Is it this dehumanizing people? But the connections are very important, and how Europeans came to think about race in Europe under fascism was very much shaped by empire, also by racial politics in the US, from which someone like Hitler and the Nazis learned a great deal.
Yeah, I left out a key word, this Darwinism and these notions of competition, of races, to find, niches, okay, and to flourish, and how then the state has its ethical duty, the highest duty then. Now, not the parliament here, not the king, but the state as the organism. Okay, you think of it like, giant squid or something, which has now to compete with others. And therefore, the interests of individuals, of groups, they have to be subordinated to this higher interest of the ethical state, which will allow, if you want, for the survival of this unit in the world. And so a great deal of science is being brought in to mapping peoples to new geopolitical, geobiological thinking, which is creates a kind of very strong basis for thinking about competition amongst peoples, which not just capital, if you want, right? So focusing then on the question of how are these bodies behaving in the modern world? What is their obligation as not voters, but as fertile bodies, gendered clearly, racialized, to the nation? And that is a thinking that's pretty well, very richly elaborated on by 1900. Okay, so
Questions, comments?
Comments on this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was doing the Arendt reading that was in the syllabus, and something I got a little bit stuck on that I was hoping you two could help me unstick. So Arendt makes a point of differentiating nationalism from fascism. And she says, this isn't, in Germany and Italy, this isn't nationalism gone wild. This is fascism taking hold in failing nation states. And she makes a point of saying these nation states are failing. But I had a bit of trouble understanding that, because these are not old nations. Like Germany and Italy were recently unified. If you think about the United States at that time, it was a young democracy. So these are like broken from the start. And empire in all these countries or nation states is more an exercise in like nationalist myth making. It's almost the start of something to bring different elements of the society together. So I guess I'm trying to understand why she specifies that these are failing nation states. It almost implies that there was a time when they weren't broken.
Well, I think, the whole question of how successful Germany and Italy were when they unified, the extent to which they solved questions of representation or developed their economies, etc., is debated by historians, but in general, in the 19th century up until World War I, these seem to be countries that were moving forward. I don't know if you would say this for Italy, but for Germany. Germany had the third largest economy in the world, and in many industries it was already exceeding Great Britain, and was getting close to the United States. It had a large army. It was both allowing socialists to exist after outlawing them for 12 years in the 19th century. They were a legitimate political party, but they were contained. It had a flourishing cultural life. It was regarded as successful. It often felt it didn't have the colonies it wanted. It didn't have as large a navy as it wanted, but it was a successful model. So when these countries, it seems to me, really begin to fail, and I'm going to talk about this in the last part of today's class, is the impact of World War I, which was particularly acute in Germany and in Italy in creating all kinds of problems, economic, social, cultural, political.
So one of the problems we used to have is it says, okay, sort of in the old days, fascism, and then you sort of say, look, hey, Italy and Germany, just always had problems. Look, the Italians were never unified. They always needed a condottiere to boss them around. The Germans are rigid and militaristic, and they never got it together. The Japanese, well, yeah, they're too. They're it was up and coming, but failed modernization. So it'd be a little like saying, look, if one had a Trumpist presidency, you say, okay, yeah, look at Ronald Reagan, okay, as a precursor, but Andrew Jackson, or even going further back, the tendency to rough, to cowboys, and you go take it back and say, it all comes from this sort of this original sin. It's not so interesting, because what's you can see kind of cutting across these tendencies globally, to have stronger executives to deal with problems of crisis, the problems, of nativism and populism. So, I think it becomes more interesting to see the broad. Hannah Arendt is a great German philosopher. This is a very difficult book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Very rich, because she does, I think, especially good on the question of how imperialism begins to generate, the anti-Semitism, that it generates also the notion of sort of useless, the sort of bodies that can be dealt any which way, outside of the body, of the liberal body, because they're not subjects. So, the genocides by the German military against the Herero in the 1890s, this raises questions, or the use of concentration camps, barbed wire in the wars in South Africa, or the Italian incredible massacres. The Italians also used barbed wire, machine guns, blimps dropping bombs in 1911, what the Italians call their first great war. So in the imperial context, you see forms of violence being developed, okay, like tried out, and that by a professional military, okay, which is then regarded as, wow, you're acting like, new warriors, crusaders, great. You're now representing the modern in us in your atavistic, backward looking, the glory of the past is coming forth in a modern way. So the empire kind of structure is useful, especially as it tries to mediate this economy, global economy, which is expanding and has different models. The liberal British, because they're the leaders. Open it up, they're going to get there first. Right? They have the most mobile capital. They've got the boats. They've got Reuters, media, and so on and so forth. Okay, all these small colonies, and then other empires who aren't going to go that way, or can't, and are trying to sort of wall off, protect, make their structure stronger, and you arrive at a military level that they're going to be able to move their way into this imperial structure, global imperial structure. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to tell me about this way, but I'm completely off base. So it sounds to me like you're saying so far that, okay, so we have limited to extremely limited representation, parliamentary, basically it's performative parliamentary democracy. There's no real power, but there's consensus because, this is also an age of great scientific and technological progress, that some of it is being distributed downward and outward, and that empire then serves a mobilizing function through race and identity. So you have both the material and the ideological consensus. So we can say that parliamentary democracy doesn't work at all, and it wasn't designed to work, but you still have a binding of the nation state through these material and ideological forces at work.
I think you're giving perhaps a much too dismal interpretation of parliamentary democracy. I think we would have probably been supporting it. Let's say even if we were socialists, there'd be divisions amongst the socialists about the relationship between a maximum program, pressing until the structures had to be transformed, and the minimum program, which could only be worked through Parliament, 8-hour day and so on, and probably the big debates that 1911, 1912 about where do you go, with strong tendency on the part of socialists to become involved in parliamentary democracy at a moment where it's a significant crisis, and that's that's a darn dilemma.
But also in some countries, the very existence of a strong labor movement, and this was true in Germany, it was true in Britain as well, leads liberals and conservative to make concessions in terms of kinds of social policy that can be very valuable to the working class. And it does create consensus even if you don't have the kind of parliamentary power you want and you're not moving toward any significant socialization. There can be some very real improvements. And this then sort of creates the dilemma of, what do you do? And do you keep trying to push the system? Do you try to overthrow it? Which was not really a realistic possibility given the size of labor movements prior to World War I. It becomes something that is attempted at the end of World War I.
Good, Michael.
I was wondering this in the readings and too for this part where I understand with what you explained in terms of the role of empire and colonialism playing in setting this up. I guess this is just kind of a general question, but was the sensibility even when this was working that it would just go on like that forever, like there would always be colonial wars and imperialist wars, or that that these countries were working toward some kind of equilibrium.
Oh, that's a very good question. I noticed Geyer, I picked up in Geyer, complicated article, got to kind of get back, German, very Germanic, but brilliant guy. So he's basically saying, look, that the understanding of, it's the 19th century, the understanding of war, that they could contain war. These elites knew how to manage war. There hadn't been significant wars. They'd been on the periphery. The Crimean War, it was an important war, bringing in big powers in the Crimea. Okay? Because there'd been civil wars, very important signs of China and the United States. But basically, wars of unification. But they were pretty confident that there was a kind of global government, a world government, through treaties amongst these empires, dated back to the Treaty of Congress of Vienna, and that's so part of what they used to call the sort of illusions that they could change everything at the same time, manage to contain, build up armies, have small conflicts over territories, but certainly never with the idea that there was going to be some sort of conflagration, and not at all.
That's a perfect segue into our third theme, which is World War I and its legacies. It's the first of many discussions we will have about the complex entanglements of war, militarization, and fascism. It's going to be a recurring theme in the course. World War I did not make fascism inevitable or cause it in any simple kind of way, but it created conditions of possibility for fascist ideas and movements to develop, and not just in Germany and Italy, but across Europe, in the US, and around the globe in the interwar decades. World War I, as Vicky suggested, was not like wars of the 19th century. There's often talk about the long peace of the 19th century. Look, 100 years in which there were no wars. Oh yes, the wars of Italian unification and German unification, but otherwise peaceful. If you were in Europe, it looked that way. In other parts of the globe, between colonial wars and civil wars, not so much. So World War I came as a shock to many Europeans, even to those among the German military and conservative elite who thought sooner or later Germany, between Russia and France and Britain, was going to be squeezed, and if it wanted to assert itself, it was going to have to fight a war at some point. Even they were surprised by World War I, and certainly no one anticipated that World War I would be the kind of war that it was, a prolonged war that involved virtually all European states except, Switzerland and Sweden. A war that was to last for 4 years and require a massive mobilization of economy and society and a great strengthening of the state, and a war in which 9 to 10 million soldiers were killed, not only in the trench warfare in the West, about which you probably know a certain amount about, but also in the equally catastrophic wars on the Eastern Front, where you had much more mobile armies sweeping back and forth across vast stretches of territory. World War I fundamentally redrew the territorial map of Europe and of European empires, and it profoundly disrupted politics, economics, culture, and societies. To begin with, it destroyed the continental empires: Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. In their place came a proliferation of competing and unstable nation states in East Central Europe: Poland was resurrected, Czechoslovakia became independent, Hungary was a separate state, Yugoslavia emerged. New states were often much more democratic. They were more democratic than their predecessors, at least initially. Some became quite authoritarian by the late 20s. Many or most were republics. They expanded the suffrage, sometimes including women, but they often lacked popularity and legitimacy, a well-developed political institutions. And this was to complicate all the questions of representation that Vicky talked about earlier. In these new states, there was not the beginning of mass politics, but an expansion of mass politics in which every political tendency was under pressure to develop its own mass party in the way that liberals and conservatives had not prior to World War I. They might have, like German agrarian conservatives had the League, the Agrarian League, which tried to sort of mobilize peasants and push them to vote. But it wasn't a mass party. The liberals didn't have one. Only the Catholics and the Social Democrats had mass parties. After World War I, every group was pressured to play mass politics, develop mass political institutions, and in some countries the fascists were able to do this much better than others were. War and its aftermath greatly expanded the power of European socialist movements, and it saw the creation of communist parties, not only in Russia, where they ruled, but across Europe. The pre-war left had been strong. It was to be much stronger in the 1920s. And some of that happened during the war. The war, because it required a total mobilization of the economy and of manpower to fight on the front, and then women power to work in the factories, led to waves of worker protest about conditions, wages, the profits capital were making, and in general to demands for a more egalitarian and democratic post-war order. World War I saw the first successful communist revolution, as I'm sure all of you know, in Russia in 1917. It saw a democratic revolution in Germany in 1918, which brought a somewhat reluctant and not terribly revolutionary Social Democratic Party to power running the new Weimar Republic. There were attempts at communist revolutions in Berlin, in Munich, and in Budapest. And there were factory occupations in Italy, about which I'm sure Vicky will say more next class. And there was a proliferation of workers' councils in Britain. Almost the only country that didn't see the workers mobilized too much was France, because they really imposed martial law on the factories. The growing power and visibility of the left was to intensify liberal and conservative fear in opposition to what was seen as a threat to elite power, the capitalist order, and efforts to restore bourgeois hegemony post-World War I. Anti-socialism and anti-Bolshevism became key rallying cries for emerging right-wing movements. Indeed, I would argue that in the immediate post-war years, into at least the mid-20s, anti-communism, anti-socialism was much more important to emerging fascist movements than anti-Semitism. Although it became, at some point, the two were associated in this concept of Judeo-Bolshevism. It's worth, I think, thinking about what it means that fascism developed as a response to a really strong left versus the current situation where not only in this country but across Europe, anything resembling that kind of left does not exist. World War I was also extraordinarily disruptive because it proved economically costly to all European countries. Russia, which had the weakest economy pre-war and the least industrialized one, proved unable to mobilize its economy, bear the costs of war, and retain the loyalty of its subjects and citizens. Mostly they were sort of subjects rather than citizens in the full sense. Germany also suffered economically because it funded the war by inflating its currency. It was easier to just go on printing money than to impose income taxes, for example, or substantial property taxes. And Germany was to go on and continue inflation post-war when it became the infamous hyperinflation of 1923. Because again, it was harder to decide politically who were you going to make pay for the war? Is it going to be the workers? Is it going to be the middle class? Is it going to be big business? An indication of just how disruptive inflation was is the fact that Hitler's first attempt at seizing power, the Munich beer hall putsch in 1923, November of 1923, came at the high point of the hyperinflation, when you had to have trillions of marks to buy a dollar. France and Britain borrowed money from the US. That's how they funded World War I. And in case of Britain, sold off some of their imperial assets. And therefore emerged much weaker. They kept their colonies, but they had these huge debts to the Americans. And they would pay them in ways that would hurt Germany even more. The US was really the only major beneficiary economically and financially of World War I. And World War I became a key stage in America's march to a kind of global hegemony by the mid-20th century. World War I also brought a variety of social and cultural transformations that were appealing and beneficial to some and very anxiety-provoking to others. And here I want to single out one that's often overlooked, and that is the way World War I transformed gender relations and created controversies around and obsessions with, what is the proper gender order and how to achieve it, that were going to be conducted in the 1920s and in which the fascists were deeply involved. World War I saw the emergence and the experience of a new kind of militarized masculinity on a very large scale. I mean, prior to the First World War, the military was a small professional cadre, sometimes drawn from the middle class, often from the aristocracy. It wasn't, there were drafts. There was conscription in Germany. There was conscription in France. There wasn't in Britain at all. Was there conscription in Italy?
Oh, yes.
But, these were people who were drafted, served briefly a year or two, and then were out. It wasn't a particularly happy experience for them at all. But one of the things that seems to have happened in World War I, in part from the experience of trench warfare in the West, is a kind of development of a camaraderie, sort of male bonding in the trenches, and a kind of valorization of the experience of being hardened fighters. Real men were now military men who recognized that violence was often necessary in the competition of nations and, after the war, in fighting against your enemies at home. These new men, looked on bourgeois society as weak, rather effete, They had a disdain for parliamentary government. They wanted to emphasize action over reason and debate. They wanted a kind of transformation, not just a reestablishment of the pre-World War I order. This kind of model of the militarized man wearing uniforms, whose main relationships were with other men in this kind of homosocial bonding, was something that became a part of the Free Corps movement in Germany, these demobilized soldiers after World War I who attacked communists and socialists and tried in 1920 to overthrow the government. They were a part of the squads in Italy, and they get picked up by National Socialism, where the ideal man is going to be the man in uniform who devotes himself to the SA or the SS or the army, and whose principal relationship is with other men in a comparable position. World War I also gave women of all classes new economic opportunities, public visibility, sexual freedom. It gave an impetus to women's movements to say, okay, we'll support the war effort, but boy, we really want the vote at war's end as our reward. The new woman of the 1920s, this more independent woman who might or might not ever want to marry and have children, who wore new short skirts and was much more visible in public, had her origins in the wartime disruptions of economy and society. Because, of course, in mobilizing for war, governments everywhere and businesses everywhere were losing many of their male workers who had to serve in the military. Who's going to do factory jobs? Well, women who once worked in agriculture, in domestic service, move into the factories, and the factories reorganize themselves, de-skilling the labor process, and women come in and fill these new semi-skilled jobs. That made these new, more visible women a figure that male workers feared. Would they ever get their jobs back? Would women supplant them? If they got their jobs back, would they be as skilled? Would they be as highly paid? But the new woman was also deeply divisive and disliked figure to many because she seemed a threat to family, to sexual norms, to male identities, as well as disrupting the public sphere. And then she was going to get the vote. And what was going to happen then? Would women vote as a bloc or not? So the war created a whole new set of gender conflicts, which are going to persist throughout the 1920s in every country, and spur a kind of anti-feminism of a particularly intense sort. Anti-feminism didn't begin after World War I, but it was intensified and became a very central platform, plank, and source of appeal for fascist movements, particularly for National Socialism. Although, as we'll see, the Nazis in power didn't necessarily, as they promised, push all women back into the home to raise children and to dutifully go to church and have no role in politics. It's much more complicated what actually happened. The final settlement of the war also created new tensions and political conflicts. Victory, as I said, was incredibly economically costly to Britain and France. They had these huge debts to the Americans. So how were they going to repay the debts? Well, in the Treaty of Versailles, they got a clause that said Germany was responsible for the war. And then they imposed reparations on the Germans. So their argument was, if the Germans pay us, then we can pay the Americans. And so you set up this cycle where the position of Britain and France remained weak. The Germans were incredibly angry at the reparations. They tried to avoid paying them by inflating the currency and by just stonewalling pain until finally, in the wake of the end of the hyperinflation, when it simply became unbearable. And what did the Germans do at the end of 23? They invented a completely new currency. And they said, we pledge all the resources of Germany to back our new currency. And, you know, since money depends on whether you believe in money, people believed in it and accepted it. And they did pay reparations, but it was a source of incredible resentment on the part of the Germans, on top of other resentments. They lost territory. In the Saarland, they lost the parts of Poland that they had had since the 18th century. They lost their colonies, which became League of Nations mandates. They lost their navy, and the army was greatly restricted. So this sets up a desire on the part of many for revising the post-war settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, regaining German national prominence. It also led many on the right, and particularly the Nazis pick up this theme to say, we Germans didn't really lose the war. We were stabbed in the back by a weak population at home, above all by the socialists who were not willing to go on fighting. So the outcome of the war was to spur all sorts of resentments about the settlement in Europe. It also fed into a belief on the part of Germany and Italy that the old, stronger colonial powers got to keep their colonies, and we had been deprived of ours, and to start talking about these bourgeois nations are discriminating against we proletarian nations, and we need to not only revise the territorial situation in Europe, we need to redraw the imperial map. In short, the multiple wartime transformations and post-war legacies created enormous disruptions. It led many to want to say, can't we just restore the pre-war order, la belle époque, this seemingly tensionless, romanticized period? But it led others to say, no, the only way we're going to restore kind of national glory and greatness is to move forward. We'll look back to an idealized past, but we have to create something new and different that's not going to be a restoration of the empires as they were. It's not going to be a recreation of the kind of liberal parliamentarism that once existed. It's going to be something new and different and sort of ill-defined at first, but it gets posited as kind of an optimistic, even maybe utopian vision. And I think that's important to remember about these fascist movements. They're not just saying we want to go back to the past, but it's trying to reimagine the future in ways that for some was very appealing. So the final, I guess, word I would have to say about World War I is the problems, again, in this global way we've been sketched out, were very similar across Europe in terms of the difficulties created. And the question becomes, which countries develop which kinds of fascist movements and which go on, in the way Paxton talked about, to not just be, marginalized small movements, but really well-anchored political parties and ultimately coming to power.
So I guess make some points which are sort of reiteration, perhaps with just trying to recall my own vocabulary. One, this crisis of bourgeois, we're talking about the crisis of this sort of classic bourgeois liberal global order, right? So if you want to create a parallelism, the crisis of the global liberal order, one keeps talking about as a background of today's crises, even though the linkages aren't very clear, haven't been worked out, and the crisis of the global liberal order, classical bourgeois-based British hegemony. Okay, British rules the waves, British leadership, the notion of a free trade empire with, however, allowing Euro colonies. So, in the first case, with the crisis of bourgeois liberal parliamentarianism, that is very widespread. You could see it in the United States, the Red Scare, the restrictions on on human rights during the World War I. And in the wake of the war, these big reactions. I mean, ran in lynchings, again, militarization, closing out immigration, Red Scares, this reaction, powerful reaction to the Soviet Revolution, which creates this global Red Scare. Global, because you could find it in China, you could find it in Japan, you could find it wherever there were new lefts. The parliaments tended to not have power during World War I. It all passes into the executives or into new organizations of military-industrial complexes. Okay? That power doesn't easily go back to the so-called free markets. Right? It remains. Charles Mayer talks about the beginning of a kind of corporatism. It doesn't mean like corporations, but of that kind of relationship between industry, government, and organized labor to the degree it can be co-opted. So there is a big transformation in the structure of bourgeois parliamentarianism. Molly emphasized very much the arrival of new protagonists, the widening of the suffrage in many places, in some places to include women, United States and Great Britain, and almost in Italy. They almost get it in Italy too, but then the parliament the legislature changes, and that's very significant. The election of veterans speak of the Blue Horizon in the first post-war legislature in France. So the presence of the veterans, and among the veterans, this emergent group, Mussolini, he coined the term trenchocracy. He said after the war, the veterans will rule, and meaning by that, the new captains, the new elite, and it was all this discussion of new elites. There you had the possibility now the middle-class soldier with his experience of violence, his experience of leadership, that they would be empowered either outside the parliament or inside, outside the parliament, with these kind of new ideas, old ideas that would empower them. And the question of empire. So think of this Versailles system as not, hey, the beginning of a new liberal government, global. It's sort of this old, hegemonic structures of constructed by the British Empire, now redone to be more popular, more Wilsonian, open up to the world, global governance, the rights of all nationalities to be represented. We're all people together and so on. But if you look at the structure of Versailles, it heavily favors these almost bankrupt old liberal empires, France and Britain, handing over to them the custody of the German colonies. It sort of wriggles around with Italy, giving it a little bit secret treaties, but also sort of trying to favor the development of national sort of sovereignties in the Yugoslav areas, which infuriates the Italians because they had signed a treaty that they'd enter into the war and then get these things. It closes out the Soviet Union. The United States is in it and outside of it. So it creates this structure which has all the glory, the beauty of a liberal world government, but without the power. And indeed is sort of resting then on all of the asymmetries and inequalities. Okay, so I think we're going to sort of leave with that. The final thing is this idea of the body politic. The war creates a notion of the mutilated body, the need for a new body, how is the state now going to manage all the veterans, how is it going to manage all the you know the widows, the children, the orphans.
Yes, the
and
whole
how-
shortage
the
of
shortage
men
of
for
men.
women to
Yeah.
marry. So how are you
Yeah.
going to
So
regrow
how
your
are you going to
population?
reconstruct, and especially with the idea, this is important, is imperialism hasn't gone away. It's mutilated, 10 million, millions of bodies, and so how are you going to recreate now this body politic to prepare now for the real Darwinian war of all against all? And this certainly was well sedimented in the United States, closing off immigration, polluting immigration. Now let's count on our own resources, Americanization campaigns. Those. So try to keep in mind now kind of the breadth of, you could say Italy get fascism, America gets Americanization with all that goes with it. And you want to sort of keep your mind flexible on this. Okay, that's that. I
Okay,
think how
questions,
Time
comments?
for questions.
Yes,
We have a few
this is
minutes
it.
left, So comments and questions.
Yeah.
Finally.
So, we'll continue, Arthur. Yeah. Oh.
I know that you spoke a little bit about, how this new gender role was something that the right and kind of the pre-fascists were against, as well as you said, kind of the strong left. Are the kind of talking points of the pre-fascists, the fascists, what have you, back then kind of similar to points? I think about it in today's politics when they're railing against communists who aren't really communists and leftists who aren't really leftists. Are there similar kind of talking points from the fascists then and the people who are fascists?
Your question is perfect, but let's start with the next 2 weeks. In other words, in some sense, we're creating contextuality, and we realize that the moment we speak about the rise of Mussolini here, there, and the other races, okay, I don't know yet. And so speaking of this sort of backdrop that we created today, we'll plunge right into how these issues are being confronted, mobilized, corrupted, and changed, manipulated.
And always keep in mind that it was a very different kind of socialist and communist movements and trade union movements then than now. So the reference can be, in many ways, quite different.
Yeah, we met.
So you mentioned before, maybe this is previewing, but you mentioned before, the strength of the left as being quite important, and I was thinking of Walter Benjamin's line that every fascism is a failed revolution or something like that, I think he said. So, there is a kind of analysis of fascism, which is about sort of crushing the left, the strength of the left, and then I've seen that analysis sometimes been used to say sort of contemporary right-wing politics, because the left, as you were saying, Molly, is not that strong today, anywhere compared to what it was, contemporary right-wing politics are misunderstood in the rubric of fascism. I wonder, how do we figure out what is sort of contingent and necessary about that, crushing of the left part, crushing of a strong left part of the rise of fascism? Is it, is this a story to some degree that you're setting up of mass politics is in complicated ways open to moving to the right or left, and there's all sorts of circumstances that push it in that way, but right-wing politics is just as much a possibility that emerges with mass politics as left-wing politics? Or is it, kind of that aspect of a really strong left and push down and suppress working people's movements, or to what we consider fascism to be? Again, maybe I'm jumping too far.
No, I think you're again, the question is well posed, and it almost expresses a correct impatience. Hey, let's get to it. And probably what we're doing this way is I'm doing is saying, we're not. Fascism seems now to me much more contingent. It's not so clear that it could have been stopped. Not that historians are supposed to rewrite the history, but it gives sort of a sense of, yes, we know it's there and there, but there's an array of sort of right-wingism, what we call like today we saw these populisms that are this way and that way, and illiberal movements. And that's what we're seeing emerging after World War I. We're seeing greatly polarization with this incredible invention occurring, which is the Soviet Revolution. It didn't occur before. There was a revolution, yes, in 1905, but that was harked back to other kinds of bourgeois revolutions of the 19th century. This is new, okay? And that is coming out of this collapse of this ideal of liberal bourgeois transformation. So you've got a lot of pieces here, and now we're going to, next week, or 2 weeks from now, start with, hey, well, let's now look at what we've got in kind of this context and see where these movements come from. Okay, they're not generated out of the war. I mean, the war, yeah, they are, but why the war? Why can't they be absorbed into liberal parliamentary structures? They are clearly these problems in Great Britain, for example, and with difficulty. Interesting, that France, in the case of France. Okay? So that's your question, I think, are for the next week. That's it.
I mean, the other thing I would add is there's the question of, if there's not a crisis like World War I, is there an analogously disruptive crisis that might push one to the extreme? If one doesn't have a strong left, can others be the target for right-wing movements in Europe? Can immigrants do it? But if they do, does it have the same resonance as an internal left? I mean, these are the kinds of questions one would want to ask, it seems to me.
Yeah, when you were talking about the crisis of parliaments at the beginning of the 20th century, I just have two small related questions. One is just you mentioned there's this question who was going to represent the middle classes, and I was kind of wondering what kinds of people specifically were they thinking of as being in the middle classes? Yeah. And then just really quick related, who were the Liberal Party representing instead of those people? What was the constituent of the Liberal Party?
Okay, so in general, the old liberal parties, what's what I call caucuses, gentlemen's clubs with client relations, right? The Liberal Party in Britain really is fairly widely organized. Enterprise, factory owners might be in England anyway. Ditto in Italy. So the liberal is a property elites, educated, very patriotic, in the sense of the old patriotism to the nation, probably loyal to the king, probably secular, that is, they're not identifying as Catholic or first and foremost religiously, though I would say Episcopalian or Church of England probably in England. I mean, it varies. So this is the liberal. When we talk about these sort of middle classes, it's like almost a political problem. It's very hard to understand exactly who all is bound. But it's partly a status question in old Europe, in Italy, and in some extent in Germany. That is, they are people without privileges that came from having property, from being part of the court system, being part of the judiciary, so they could be small state functionaries. There are increasing numbers of those. There'll be people who are working in department stores much later. That's much more of the 20th century. But that's old shopkeepers who a huge turnover. Small proprietors in the countryside. That's usually regarded as a kind of a classic type.
But whether those are represented by liberals or liberals try to varies from country to country. In Germany, absolutely no. This old and new lower middle class.
Yeah, they're not being represented.
Are not going to be represented by the liberals.
They're coming in later because they don't get the vote even, and so it's more and more significant as especially when you get phenomena like inflation, as they're very affected. If they're small proprietors, they're affected in terms of getting rents. if they're consumers in terms of the cost of goods, if they're shopkeepers, the problem of passing things along. So it's a very wide urban strata, which appears more and more with the urbanization of late 19th century. And there's going to be a lot of theorizing. Where do they fit? What is this group? Because the Marxists kind of call them out. The Marxists and Socialists saying, they're not us. They're not for us. We don't. We're not talking about saving property or saving the value of property or saving status for you rancorous little petty bourgeoisie. You've got to, if you're courageous, you'll join us, knowing you're going to be wiped out. If you're chicken shit and worried about your status, well, you're going to go down anyway. So there's a kind of a political void around these people. Not only, though, there are leaders. For example, the famous mayor of Vienna, Lueger, who develops a Christian liberal social program, including anti-Semitism. Hey, that's part nationalism, but also social provision, corporatism. Catholic idea of people should be equal, and he is so popular. I mean, he's regarded globally very popular. So being kind of a social Catholic, that was a good bit. That was a good. The trouble is in Italy, the Catholics were kept out of Parliament by the Pope for so very, very long. So,
but in Germany, the Catholics were very successful at developing a mass party that really paralleled what the Socialists did. They had these vast subcultures. You not only had the party, you had your trade unions, you had your Social Democratic Bicycle Club, you had your Catholic Bicycle Club, you had your Catholic Women's Movement, you had your Social Democratic Movement. The joke used to be in all of them you could go from cradle to grave and live within these politicized milieus or countercultures.
So think of the war, a war in 1914 to 1918, 1915 to 1918, and there's immense mobilization, immense transformations of the economy, pulling people into the cities, creating mass factories. The men on the front, and then this return home. The return, the factories, whether the women stay in or be pushed out. What's going to happen now? What is peace after this extraordinary time of this decline, this change? And in that, some people continue with their old groups. The Socialists, okay, but then they're expanding. Their new veterans organizations, some go left, others don't. So there's a kind of great disorientation about political alignment after World War I, and you can find that fairly widely with very significant shifts in voting. And I don't know how it works out in the United States, but certainly.
Looking at me.
Get Republicans in the United States. So you get these big shifts in the wake of the war, and in that framework, you get some really significant shifts with the emergence of these new social movements that then become political parties, and that's what we've been talking about. Why are they able to transform themselves from being protest movements into political parties and gain them a lot of legitimacy? Because that whole process is.
I would tell you what happens in America, but we're out of time.
Oh.
So, I want to thank our professors.
Thank you. So for next week, we're going to focus on Italy, but as a case, a case that we can speak about more globally, which we can help, again, understand what goes on there, but generalize from it. I've given you this book I wrote. It's called The Perfect Fascist, and the virtue of it, okay, it's a story of an American, or idea of rights and individualism, and she's Jewish too. A man who wants to become the perfect fascist, and so we can see the kind of the sweep of him coming up as a soldier in the colonies to become minister foreign colonies, then he's going to be purged and so on and so forth. I won't tell you the end of the story. It's not a big book. It's a PDF. You have that there. I'm sorry, get some copies of it. But sort of think of it as a story that could help you. We're going to send out some questions, and I'm going to rewrite Paxton's questions and say, hey, look for that in this book. I mean, so we have that is kind of background.
And it also raises very interesting questions about exactly who the new fascist man is and the new fascist woman and the place of empire throughout this story of this man's life and of fascist.
One very quick one, then we can go. The school, the Academy for Socialist Education, which is sponsoring this course, is sponsoring another, which some of you probably already know, and many of you may know, and may even enrolled in, but I wanted to remind you. That's a course on imperialism. It will begin near the end of October, but to enroll in it, you need to do that by a week, this coming Sunday. That's the enrollment deadline for that course. There are other courses in the works for the winter and spring, and you'll learn more about them, but we'll see you all in 2 weeks, and our impatience will be rewarded.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.